We often talk about geopolitical flashpoints. It's a term we throw around a lot, but most of the time they're potential flashpoints, places where things might go wrong. There is one place on Earth, though, where the crisis isn't potential, it's permanent. A place where the artillery density is so high, the targeting coordinates so pre-calculated that military planners have a name for what a war would look like. They call it a sea of fire. We're talking, of course, about the Korean Peninsula.
It's a 70-year-old standoff. I mean, think about that. It has outlasted the entire Cold War. The Soviet Union, its original patron, doesn't even exist anymore. It's survived 14 U.S. presidents, each with their own policy, their own approach. And yet, if you look at the intelligence reports we have on the desk today, the situation feels more dangerous now than it has in decades.
It really does. And it's what some theorists call a wicked problem, isn't it? It's not just complicated. It's a problem where every solution you come up with seems to create another, maybe even worse problem.
That's the perfect term for it. In international relations, we're usually dealing with, shifting alliances or emerging threats, things that are fluid. But Korea is different. It's this frozen, calcified conflict that is paradoxically also incredibly dynamic and volatile. You have a war that never technically ended. It's just an armistice, a pause. You have the most heavily fortified border in the world, and behind that border you have a rogue state that has managed to do something truly unique.
Which is build a credible nuclear arsenal.
A credible nuclear arsenal capable of hitting the United States mainland. And they've done it while being subjected to arguably the most comprehensive sanctions regime in human history. It defies a lot of our conventional wisdom.
And that's exactly what we want to get into today. We're not just going to skim the headlines about the latest missile test. We're going to try to dissect the strategic logic. You want to understand why. Why, after all this time, after billions of dollars in aid and pressure and diplomacy, have the United States and South Korea and really the entire world failed to solve this? Is it really just as simple as saying the North Korean leadership is crazy? Or is there something else going on, a cold, hard rationality that maybe we just don't want to admit is there?
That is the mission for this deep dive, to move past that caricature of the, mad dictator in Pyongyang and to look at the structural realities, the constraints. And to do that, we're not just offering opinions. We are bringing in some academic heavy artillery of our own. We are building this entire discussion on a very specific set of high-level sources.
Okay, let's lay them out. So you at home know exactly where this analysis is coming from. We are leaning very heavily on an article from the Washington Quarterly by Nicholas Anderson. It's called America's North Korean Nuclear Trilemma. And that's going to give us our main theoretical framework for the whole discussion.
It's a brilliant piece. Then we have The Perils of Strategic Patience with North Korea, which is a really sharp critique of U.S. policy by Jong-kun Choi, also from the Washington Quarterly. And to get into the military dynamics, there's a fascinating paper by Terence Roehrig from the Korean Journal of Defense Analysis. It's titled North Korea, Nuclear Weapons, and the Stability-Instability Paradox.
Which sounds complicated, but we'll break it down. And then for the internal situation, the economics, the politics, we're drawing on a book called Hard Target, Engaging North Korea. It's by Stephen Haggard and Marcus Noland. We're focusing specifically on chapters 6 and 7.
And we're cross-referencing all that with the hard data. We have the North Korea September 2022 update from the Congressional Research Service that gives us the specifics on missile types, food shortages, that kind of thing. And finally, to really bring it up to the present day and understand the recent war drumming, we have a commentary by a former intelligence officer named Sidney Seiler. His piece is called North Korea, Preparing for War, Mere Blustering, or Something in Between. And of course, all this is supplemented with our general course materials on international relations in Asia.
Okay, so we have the theory, we have the history, and we have the, frankly, terrifying modern reality. Let's start in the big picture. One of the most frustrating things for anyone watching this is that sense of, Groundhog Day. It feels like the same cycle over and over. We demand, they disarm, they refuse, we sanction them, they test a missile, we try to talk, the talks fall apart, rinse and repeat for 30 years. But Nicholas Anderson, in that first article we mentioned, argues this isn't just a string of failures. It's not bad luck. He says we are trapped in what he calls a trilemma.
And this is such a useful concept because it takes the emotion out of it. It takes the who's to blame part out and just looks at the geometry of the problem. Anderson's argument is that the United States has, for decades, held 3 core objectives when it comes to North Korea. 3 things we desperately want to be true, all at the same time.
Okay, let's list them. The first one is obvious, right? It's the nukes.
Right. Objective number 1 is CVID. It's an acronym you hear all the time in policy circles. It stands for Complete, Verifiable, and Irreversible Dismantlement of Their Nuclear Program.
Complete, verifiable, irreversible.
Exactly. It's the absolute gold standard. We don't just want them to freeze the program. We don't want them to just stop building more. We want them to scrap every single warhead, dismantle every centrifuge, destroy every blueprint, and, this is the key part, let international inspectors in to prove that it's all gone forever. That has been the stated public goal of U.S. policy for decades.
Okay, that's Objective 1, CVID. What's number 2?
Objective 2 is the maintenance of the alliance and forward deployment. In simpler terms, we want to keep U.S. troops on the Korean Peninsula. We have about 28,500 soldiers in South Korea. We have massive bases there, like Camp Humphreys. We want to maintain our ironclad military alliance with the Republic of Korea, because that alliance does more than just deter the North. It projects American power into East Asia. It's a check on China. It's a cornerstone of our entire posture in the Pacific.
So keep the nukes out, keep our troops in. And Objective 3 seems like the most basic one of all.
Objective 3 is avoiding war. And Anderson is very specific here. He doesn't just mean avoiding a minor border skirmish. He means avoiding a catastrophic Second Korean War, the kind of massive conflict that would likely be necessary to forcibly remove those weapons if they won't give them up peacefully. A war that planners estimate could result in hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of casualties in the first few weeks, and the potential destruction of Seoul and maybe even Tokyo.
Okay, so CVD, keep the alliance, avoid war. On the surface, those all sound like perfectly reasonable, sensible goals for a superpower. Why on earth can't we have all three?
And that is the cruel math of the trilemma. Anderson's central argument is that these three goals are structurally incompatible. They exist in a state of tension with each other. You can logically only achieve two of them at any given time. He calls it the pick two rule. When you choose two, the third one inevitably has to be sacrificed.
All right, let's run the simulation then. Let's walk through the scenarios. So, scenario A. Let's say I'm the U.S. president. I decide that denuclearization is my absolute top non-negotiable priority. I must get rid of those weapons. And I'm also a moral person who refuses to start a war that would kill millions of people. So I pick Objective 1, CVD, and Objective 3, avoid war. What do I have to give up?
According to the logic of the trilemma, you have to give up Objective 2. You have to sacrifice the alliance and the forward deployment of U.S. troops.
That feels completely counterintuitive. Why would pulling our troops out of Korea help us get rid of their nukes? Wouldn't that just remove all our leverage?
It's about flipping the script and looking at it from Pyongyang's perspective. Why do they have nuclear weapons in the first place? Is it because they have this grand ambition to conquer the world? No. The forces are pretty clear on this. For them, it's a security guarantee. It's an insurance policy. The North Korean leadership looks at what happened to Saddam Hussein in Iraq. They look at what happened to Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, who famously gave up his nuclear program. They see a very clear pattern. Regimes that don't have a nuclear deterrent get invaded and overthrown by the United States. The primary driver of their insecurity, the hostile U.S. policy that they complain about constantly in their propaganda, is the physical presence of 28,500 American troops on their southern border, backed by the nuclear umbrella that protects South Korea.
So the argument is, if we want them to voluntarily disarm, to give up their insurance policy without us having to fight them for it, we have to first remove the threat that makes them feel like they need that insurance policy to begin with.
That's it exactly. In this scenario, the U.S. would have to offer a grand bargain. We'd have to say something like, look, we will sign a peace treaty to formally end the Korean War. We will withdraw U.S. forces from the peninsula. We might even have to abrogate the Mutual Defense Treaty with South Korea. Oh, no. We would have to fundamentally change the security architecture of the region to signal the threat is gone. You are safe from us. Now you can hand over the weapons.
But wow, I mean, that's a massive gamble. We pull out and there is absolutely no guarantee they'd follow through. They could just pocket our concessions and keep their bombs. And the geopolitical fallout, abandoning a key ally like South Korea, creating a power vacuum that China would rush to fill. It seems politically impossible for any U.S. administration to even consider that.
Which is precisely why, in the real world, we never seriously pursue Scenario A. It's just too risky and the costs are too high. So, okay, let's look at Scenario B. Let's try a different combination. You, as president, say, okay, forget that. The alliance is non-negotiable. I am keeping my troops right where they are. And I am also absolutely insisting on CVD. I am going to get those nukes one way or another.
That sounds much more familiar. That sounds a lot like the public rhetoric of almost every U.S. administration for the last 20 years. We stand shoulder to shoulder with South Korea, and we demand complete denuclearization.
It's the rhetoric, yes. But Anderson's point is about what it takes to achieve that outcome. If you want to achieve both of those things simultaneously, if you want to force North Korea to disarm while you maintain a hostile military presence on their border, they will never, ever agree to that voluntarily. From their perspective, that's just unilateral surrender. It's suicide. So if they won't give them up peacefully under those conditions, what's the only way left to get that outcome?
You have to go in and take the weapons from them.
You have to go to war.
It means war.
It means a forceful counter-proliferation operation. It means regime change. You have to invade and dismantle the program by force. And that directly violates the third objective, avoiding a catastrophic war. And we have to be brutally honest about what that war would look like. It wouldn't just be surgical strikes. As we mentioned, North Korea has, by some estimates, over 10,000 artillery pieces and rocket launchers dug into hardened sites in the mountains just north of the demilitarized zone. They call it the Kaesong Heights. Most of them are aimed directly at the Greater Seoul metropolitan area, which is home to 25 million people, half the population of South Korea. Even with just conventional artillery, military models predict hundreds of thousands of civilian casualties in the first few hours and days of a conflict. That's before a single nuclear weapon is even considered.
So scenario B is basically a non-starter because the human cost is just unthinkably high.
Precisely. No U.S. president, Republican or Democrat, has ever been willing to trade the city of Seoul for Pyongyang's nuclear program. The price is just too high. So if scenario A is too risky geopolitically, and scenario B is too costly in human lives, where does that leave us? By a simple process of elimination.
We're left with scenario C.
We land squarely in scenario C, and this is the reality we've been living in. In scenario C, we choose to keep the alliance. The troops stay, the joint military drills continue, that's a priority. We also choose to avoid war. We don't invade, we don't launch a massive preemptive strike, that's also a priority. And the inevitable result of prioritizing those two things.
We have to give up on CVE.
We tacitly accept that complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement is not going to happen, at least not in the foreseeable future.
Sure.
We effectively accept North Korea as a de facto nuclear state.
And Anderson's core point is that this isn't some future choice we have to make. This is the choice we have already made over and over again. We just haven't admitted it, either to ourselves or to the public.
That's the uncomfortable truth that the trilemma exposes. For the last 20 years, regardless of the president's party or rhetoric, the operational reality has been to prioritize the alliance with South Korea and regional stability over the actual elimination of the weapons themselves. We manage the problem. We contain it. We deter it. We don't solve it. Anderson concludes that in the short run, this is probably the only rational choice to avoid a catastrophe. But it requires us to be intellectually honest about our goals. It implies we need to stop pretending that the next round of sanctions or the next diplomatic initiative is going to magically lead to CVED. It won't. The structure of the problem prevents it.
That is a very bitter pill to swallow. But let's say we do. Let's just accept it for the sake of argument. We accept that North Korea has the bomb and they're going to keep it. The immediate fear that I think most people have is, okay, fine, but now that they have a nuclear shield, are they going to become even more dangerous? If they know we can't invade them without risking nuclear war, does that basically give them a license to attack South Korea with conventional weapons, knowing we can't fully retaliate?
You've just perfectly described one of the most debated and, frankly, unnerving concepts in international security. This is the stability-instability paradox. And Terence Roerig's article for the Korean Journal of Defense Analysis dives deep into this exact question as it applies to the peninsula.
Stability, instability. It sounds like a complete oxymoron. How can something be both?
It's a theory that emerged from the Cold War, trying to make sense of the U.S.-Soviet relationship. The theory goes like this. At the highest level, the strategic level, nuclear weapons create stability. Because both the United States and the Soviet Union had thousands of nuclear weapons aimed at each other, neither side wanted to launch a full-scale war. It would be suicide. It guaranteed mutual assured destruction. So the existence of these massive arsenals made World War III, a direct superpower conflict, almost unthinkable. And in that sense, the world was stable.
Okay, that's the good news part of the theory.
That's the good news. But here's the paradox. Because both sides know that World War III is off the table, it paradoxically creates instability at the lower levels of conflict. One side might think, well, I can get away with a little bit more now. I can fund a proxy war in a third world country. I can shoot down one of their spy planes. I can launch a small border raid. No, they feel safer doing these provocative things because they know the other side is too terrified of escalation to respond with overwhelming force. They won't risk a nuclear exchange over a minor incident.
That's a great analogy you used earlier. It's like two guys arguing in a room filled with dynamite. You might feel safe throwing a punch because you know the other guy isn't going to light a match and blow you both up. The dynamite makes you less likely to use your ultimate weapon, which in turn makes you more likely to engage in smaller fights.
That is a perfect way to put it.
Yeah.
And so the huge concern for decades has been that North Korea, emboldened by its own nuclear deterrent, will start throwing a lot more punches at South Korea.
But Roerig's article argues it's not quite that simple in this case, right? Because when I look at the history, and you know this better than I do, North Korea was throwing some pretty wild punches long before they had a single nuclear weapon.
Exactly. And this is where getting the history right is absolutely vital to understanding the present. If you think North Korea is aggressive and unpredictable now, you should take a hard look at the late 1960s. That was their most provocative period. Let's talk about the Blue House raid in January of 1968. This is a story that's often forgotten in the West, but it is seared, absolutely seared into the memory of every South Korean.
This was the Commando Raid, the assassination attempt on the South Korean president, Park Chung-hee.
It was an operation straight out of a spy thriller, but with horrific real-world consequences. North Korea handpicked 31 elite commandos from a special operations unit called Unit 124. Their mission was to infiltrate Seoul and kill the president. They slipped across the DMZ in the dead of winter, cut through the fences, hiked through the frozen mountains, and marched right into the capital city, disguised in South Korean army uniforms. They got to within a few hundred meters of the Blue House, which is their equivalent to the White House.
And they were only stopped by chance at the very last second, wasn't it?
A local police chief got suspicious and challenged them at a checkpoint. They tried to bluff their way through, but he pressed them. So they just pulled out their submachine guns and grenades, and a massive firefight erupted in the streets of Seoul. They were throwing grenades at city buses. Civilians were killed. In the end, over 20 South Koreans died, and almost all of the commandos were hunted down and killed or captured over the next few days. One escaped back to the north. This was an unbelievable act of war, a direct attempt to decapitate the government, and they had zero nuclear weapons at the time.
And just a few days after that raid, in that same week, they seized a U.S. Navy ship.
The USS Pueblo. An intelligence-gathering ship, a spy ship, operating in international waters. They boarded it, captured all 83 crew members, killed one sailor in the process, and held the rest hostage for 11 months. They were brutally tortured. This was a tiny, impoverished, non-nuclear state humiliating a global superpower. It created a massive crisis for the Johnson administration.
So Roerig's core argument is that North Korea has always been what he calls risk-tolerant. They didn't suddenly need a nuclear shield to start acting provocatively. This is just who they are.
That's his main point.
Yeah.
He suggests that the stability-instability paradox doesn't perfectly map onto the Korean case because North Korea isn't becoming aggressive due to its nukes. Provocation and limited warfare have always been part of their statecraft. But, and this is a crucial nuance, while they have always been aggressive, the nature of their aggression is highly calculated. Look at the events of 2010, a much more recent example. In March, a North Korean submarine torpedoed the South Korean naval corvette, the Cheonan, killing 46 sailors. Then in November of that same year, they fired a barrage of artillery shells at a South Korean island called Yeongpyeong, killing 2 soldiers and 2 civilians.
I remember that year vividly. It felt like we were on the brink of a major war.
It did. But notice what didn't happen. It didn't spiral out of control into a general war. North Korea calibrated those attacks perfectly. They were outrageous acts of violence, but they were just below the threshold that would have forced the U.S. and South Korea into a massive regime-ending retaliation. Roerig uses a specific term for this. He calls it deterrence by punishment. Their message is, we can inflict painful costs on you at any time, so don't push us too far. Back off. It's a way of signaling their resolve.
And there's another layer to this strategy that Roerig brings up, which I found fascinating. He calls it the catalytic posture. It sounds like they're trying to trigger a chemical reaction or something.
It's the strategy of the week, and it's brilliant in a very cynical way. It's the idea of using volatility to force a powerful third party to intervene on your behalf. In this case, that third party is China. North Korea knows that the one thing Beijing fears more than anything is instability on its border. China does not want a war in Korea. They don't want millions of refugees flooding into Manchuria, and they certainly don't want to collapse North Korea that leads to U.S. troops standing on the Yalu River, right on their border. So when Pyongyang manufactures a crisis, When they test a missile or sink a ship, they're often trying to get China's attention. They're trying to force Beijing to step in and say to Washington and Seoul, okay, everyone, calm down. Let's get back to the table. Maybe we should give North Korea some of the food aid or security assurances they want, just to quiet things down. They essentially monetize their own unpredictability. It's a way of using their weakness as a weapon.
So they're not just playing a game with South Korea and the U.S., they're playing a three-dimensional chess game that includes their own patron, China. This all begs the question then, why haven't we been able to stop this cycle? We've tried pressure, we've tried engagement. Why does everything seem to fail? And this brings us right to that searing critique of U.S. policy by Jong-Kun Choi and the historical context from the Hard Target book.
We really have to look at the pendulum of policy over the past few decades because we've swung from one extreme to the other. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, under the progressive South Korean presidents Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun, we saw the era of the Sunshine Policy.
Right, the Sunshine Era. The theory was based on that old Aesop's fable, right? The sun and the wind have a contest to see who can get a man to take off his coat. The wind blows harder and harder, and the man just clutches his coat tighter. But when the sun shines warmly, he takes it off voluntarily. The idea was that if you expose North Korea to warmth, to capitalism, to kindness, to engagement, they'll voluntarily put down their guns.
It was a classic liberal institutionalist dream. The core idea was to separate economics from politics. The architects of this policy thought, let's not argue about nukes right now. Let's build trust through cooperation. So they championed projects like the Kaesong Industrial Complex, a special zone where South Korean companies could build factories and hire cheap North Korean labor. They talked about reconnecting roads and railways across the DMZ. The belief was that economic integration would create what political scientists call a spillover effect. If North Korea became dependent on trade and investment from the South, the cost of going to war would become too high for them. They would slowly, organically transform from a rogue state into a normal trading partner.
But it just didn't work out that way. The North seemed perfectly happy to take the South money, but they didn't open up politically or disarm.
In fact, the Hard Target book points out that they were very clever about ring-fencing the engagement. They kept the Kaesong workers completely isolated from the rest of the North Korean population. They made sure the virus of freedom and information couldn't spread. And meanwhile, the hard currency that those factories generated went straight into the regime's pockets, which they then used to help fund their illicit weapons programs. So eventually, South Korean public opinion turned against it. The pendulum swung back hard. The conservatives took power in Seoul under President Lee Myung-bak. And after the shock of the Cheonan thinking in 2010, they brought the hammer down with what were called the May 24 measures.
These were the really strict sanctions from the South Korean side.
The strictest ever. It was a near-total reversal of the Sunshine Policy. It cut off almost all inter-Korean trade. It banned North Korean ships from using South Korean waters. It stopped all new investment and aid. The only thing left was the Kaesong complex, and even that was eventually shut down later. It was a full return to a policy of containment and pressure.
And this shift in Seoul happened to coincide with the Obama administration's policy in Washington, which became known as strategic patience. Now, I've heard this term for years, but Jong-Kun Choi, in his article, is just incredibly critical of it. He seems to think it was just a fancy intellectual-sounding name for doing absolutely nothing.
He argues it was worse than doing nothing. He says it was a policy rooted in a deep and persistent delusion. He calls this delusion collapsism. You have to understand, for the last 30 years, there has been a recurring belief in Western policy circles and intelligence agencies that the North Korean regime is constantly on the brink of collapse. Experts looked at the devastating famine in the 1990s, at the death of the founder Kim Il-sung, then the death of his son Kim Jong-il. They looked at the economic isolation and the sheer inefficiency of their system, and they kept concluding, this can't last, the math just doesn't work, the regime is going to implode any day now.
So strategic patience wasn't really a strategy to solve the problem. It was a strategy of just waiting for the problem to die of natural causes.
Choi makes a brilliant literary comparison. He says it was like the Samuel Beckett play, Waiting for Godot. We just stood by the side of the road. We refused to engage in serious high-level negotiations. We refused to offer any major concessions. We just kept applying sanctions and checking our watches, waiting for the regime to crumble under its own weight so we could then walk in, pick up the pieces, and reunify the peninsula on our terms.
But the regime, as Haggard and Nolan call it, is a hard target. It's proven to be incredibly resilient.
It is brutally, stubbornly resilient. And here's Choi's devastating point. While we were waiting for them to die, they weren't dying. They were building. He argues that strategic patience gave North Korea the single most valuable commodity of all time. It gave them about 8 years of relatively low-pressure time to perfect their technology, time to refine their uranium enrichment centrifuges, time to test more powerful missiles, time to figure out how to miniaturize a nuclear warhead so it could fit on top of one of those missiles. By the time the world, and particularly the U.S., woke up and realized they weren't collapsing, it was too late. They had made the leap and become a full-fledged nuclear power.
It's a tragic irony, then. By refusing to deal with the problem because we thought it would solve itself, we inadvertently allowed it to become permanent. And that brings us right up to the present day. To the North Korea, September 2022 update from the Congressional Research Service and Sydney Seiler's really ominous commentary. Because we're not in the sunshine era anymore, and we're not even in the strategic patience era, we are in a new and much more dangerous phase.
We're in an era of rapid qualitative acceleration. The CRS report is great because it gets into the technical details that are genuinely game-changing. It's not just that they have more missiles now. It's that the quality and type of missile has fundamentally shifted. And to understand why that matters so much, we need to talk for a minute about the difference between liquid-fueled and solid-fueled ballistic missiles.
Okay, this is a technical detail, but it's one that has huge strategic implications. Liquid fuel is the old stuff, right? Like the old Soviet Scud missiles used.
Right. Liquid propellants are powerful, but they're incredibly corrosive and unstable. You can't just leave the fuel inside the missile for long periods. It would eat through the tanks. So before you can launch one of these, you have to go through a whole process. You have to haul the missile out to a launch pad. You have to bring a convoy of tanker trucks filled with fuel and oxidizer. You have to stand the missile up vertically. You have to painstakingly pump the fuel in. That whole process can take hours, maybe even a full day.
And during those hours, U.S. spy satellites can see what's happening. They see the convoy of trucks. They see the activity at the launch site. And that gives us a warning. It gives us time to decide what to do. Do we try to strike it on the pad? Do we alert our allies? Do we evacuate personnel? We have a decision window.
Exactly. It provides a crucial decision window for national leadership. But the CRS report highlights North Korea's successful testing and deployment of a whole new family of missiles. The KN-23, the KN-24, and now new intercontinental ballistic missiles that all use solid fuel. Solid fuel is completely different. It's chemically stable. It's capped into the rocket motor at the factory like a giant hard rubber eraser. It's pre-packaged. This means you can put the missile on a big camouflage truck, what's called a transporter erector launcher. You can hide that truck in a cave or a tunnel, drive it out to a random spot on a highway, push a button to lift the missile upright, and fire it in a matter of minutes.
The classic shoot-and-scoot tactic.
Exactly. And what this does is it collapses that decision window for the United States and South Korea from hours down to just minutes. It creates an incredibly tense hair-trigger environment. If our satellites detect a massive heat bloom from North Korea, we have only seconds to try and determine if it's a test launch or the first strike of a nuclear attack. That significantly increases the risk of a catastrophic miscalculation or an accidental war.
And it's not just the technology that's changed. The whole geopolitical landscape has shifted under their feet. Seiler's commentary really emphasizes the Russia variable. For years, Russia was, at least nominally, on our side when it came to non-proliferation. They voted for the United Nations sanctions against North Korea.
The war in Ukraine changed everything. Russia is desperate for basic military supplies, especially artillery shells for its old Soviet-era guns. North Korea happens to have one of the largest stockpiles of compatible Soviet-caliber shells in the world. So as Seiler points out, a new and very dangerous partnership has formed. Pyongyang is shipping millions of munitions to Moscow to fuel the war in Ukraine. And in return, they're not just getting cash or food, they're almost certainly getting advanced Russian military technology.
What kind of technology are we talking about?
The shopping list is terrifying. The speculation from the intelligence community is that they want help with their spy satellite program, which they've struggled with. They need better guidance systems, better telemetry for their long-range missiles. And perhaps the biggest fear is that they're getting Russian help with their submarine-launched ballistic missile program. If North Korea can develop a truly quiet submarine and put a nuclear missile on it that can slip undetected into the Pacific Ocean, then our entire defensive posture changes. The containment is broken.
And Seiler points out one more shift that, for me, is maybe the most psychological and chilling of all. It's not about hardware. It's about ideology. It's about how Kim Jong-un has started talking about South Korea.
This is a profound shift. He calls it the end of reunification. You see, for 70 years, the founding ideology of both North and South Korea rested on the idea that they were one people, one nation, temporarily and tragically divided by outside powers. The North's propaganda always said, the South Koreans are our brothers and sisters, our compatriots, who are being held hostage by the Yankee imperialists. Our sacred mission is to liberate them and reunify our fatherland.
It was a nationalist narrative at its core. We are all Koreans.
Exactly. But in a series of speeches recently, Kim Jong-un has completely jettisoned that. He has formally declared the Republic of Korea in the South as the principal enemy, a hostile foreign state. He's ordered the dismantling of government agencies that were tasked with promoting dialogue and reunification. He even tore down a major monument in Pyongyang that symbolized the hope for reunification.
What does that mean in practical military terms?
It means the ideological gloves are off. If South Koreans are no longer your compatriots to be liberated, but are simply citizens of an enemy country, then using nuclear weapons against their cities becomes much easier to justify to your own military and your own people. It removes that ethnic, brotherly buffer that might have created some hesitation. Seiler warns that this new language justifies a war of subjugation or annexation, not a war of liberation. It's a much darker, more traditional state-on-state framework for conflict. One that could, for the first time, plausibly involve the use of tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield in Korea.
That is a profoundly grim pivot. But before we get to our final thoughts, we have to look at the engine room of all this. How is North Korea paying for this incredibly advanced weapons program? We hear constantly about how they're under crippling sanctions, how their people are starving, and yet the missiles keep flying. The hard target book and the CRS data get into this.
It's the central puzzle of the hard target economy. Haggard and Nolan describe what is essentially a bifurcated economy, two economies existing in the same country. On the one hand, you have what they call the court economy, or the palace economy. This is the pot of money controlled directly by the Kim family and the top military elites. This is funded almost entirely by illicit activities that operate outside the formal economy. We're talking about massive cybercrime. North Korean state-sponsored hackers from groups like the Lazarus Group have stolen billions of dollars in cryptocurrency. We're talking about sophisticated sanctions evasion, like ship-to-ship transfers of coal and oil on the high seas. And now, of course, the big Russian arms deals. This money goes straight to the nuclear and missile programs, and to buying the luxury goods, the Mercedes-Benz cars, the French cognac, needed to keep the generals and the elites loyal to the regime.
Okay, so that's the court economy. What's the other half?
The other half is the people's economy. And this is a story of collapse and adaptation. The old communist public distribution system, where the state was supposed to provide everyone with food and necessities, completely collapsed during the famine of the 1990s. The government effectively stopped feeding its people. So the people, out of sheer necessity, adapted. They created their own grassroots quasi-capitalist system. They're called janmadang. They're informal black markets that have sprung up in every town and city. People started trading, smuggling goods across the Chinese border, growing their own food on small private plots of land, and selling the surplus.
So the regime is able to survive because it's essentially outsourced the job of feeding the population to the population itself.
That's a huge part of its resilience. The CRS report notes that even today, an estimated 40% of the population is undernourished. Food insecurity is chronic. But because the regime has allowed this black market economy to exist, it doesn't have to shoulder the full welfare burden for its citizens. It can let them fend for themselves. And that frees up an enormous portion of the state's resources. Some estimates suggest North Korea spends nearly a quarter of its entire gross domestic product on the military. That's a ratio unheard of anywhere else in the world. The entire system is brutally and efficiently designed for one thing and one thing only: regime survival, not economic growth, and certainly not human flourishing.
Okay, let's try to pull all these threads together. This has been a lot to process. We started with Anderson's trilemma, which basically says we're stuck. We're stuck because we prioritize our alliance with South Korea and we want to avoid a catastrophic war, which means we have to tacitly accept North Korea's nuclear weapons. Then we looked at Roerig's instability paradox, which suggests that the nukes might prevent a big war, but they also enable North Korea's strategy of deterrence by punishment, these calculated low-level provocations. We saw how the policy of strategic patience failed because the regime collapse we were all waiting for just never happened. And now, today, we're facing a new North Korea, one that is technologically faster with solid fuel missiles, geopolitically supported by Russia, and ideologically more hostile than ever, having abandoned the very concept of peaceful reunification.
It's an incredibly sobering picture. All the old playbooks we used to rely on seem to be broken. Sanctions and isolation haven't stopped their weapons development. The hope of the Sunshine Policy didn't disarm them, and waiting for them to collapse just gave them time to get stronger. The trilemma suggests we're already living in a reality where North Korea is a permanent nuclear state. And so the final provocative question that comes out of all these sources, from Anderson, from Seiler, is whether we, the United States and our allies, have the political courage to admit that our old goal is dead.
And if we admit it, if we admit that denuclearization isn't going to happen, then what? What do we do instead?
The logical conclusion is that our entire strategy has to shift. We have to move away from the maximalist goal of denuclearization and toward a more pragmatic, if less satisfying, goal of risk reduction. We stop pretending we can get them down to zero nuclear weapons, and we start focusing intensely on making sure the weapons they do have are never used. That means opening up lines of communication, even with a regime we despise, setting up military-to-military hotlines to prevent miscalculations, maybe even down the road having difficult conversations about arms control and strategic stability. We would have to start treating them less like a criminal enterprise to be busted and more like the lethal nuclear-armed adversary they actually are, one that has to be managed and deterred for the long haul.
Managing a nuclear neighbor. It feels like admitting defeat.
It is an admission of the defeat of our past ambitions. There's no way around that. But as Sidney Seiler so powerfully implies, sticking to the old script when the actors and the technology have fundamentally changed is not just foolish, it's incredibly dangerous. The flashing yellow light, as he puts it, is on. Kim Jong-un is actively rewriting the rules of deterrence on the Korean Peninsula. If we don't update our own strategy to match this new, solid-fueled, Russia-backed, ideologically hardened reality, we risk stumbling blindly into the one outcome we spent more than 70 years successfully trying to avoid.
The sea of fire.
A sea of fire.
That is a very heavy place to leave this, but I suppose that's why we do this, to understand the stakes.
It's why it matters. The cost of ignorance on this issue is just too high to contemplate.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. As always, we encourage you to go read the sources for yourself. Anderson, Choi, Roehrig, it's really worth your time.
Stay critical.
We'll see you on the next deep dive.